Okay. Yeah, let's see who's here. John P, Peter, Dennis, and is that Tom?
No, Valerie.
And Simon.
Oh, Valerie.
Tom
Hi,
is not.
Valerie.
Tom is
Hi.
not around. Tom is not around. Simon Dobson.
Oh yeah, Simon. Hi.
And that's it.
Okay, that's a nice group.
Yeah, sorry, I think we have 2 hours if we wanted. Well, we found these discussions, I think that seems rather too long to keep going for. So
Yeah.
I would suggest an option possibly is to say take a 10-minute break after an hour. If we feel we might want to go on longer than an hour, we should maybe take a break of 10 minutes after an hour to each get ourselves a cup of coffee or whatever and
I think that's a good idea. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the topic we are discussing is interventions. Well, broadly, everything that has to do with it. And I thought that maybe a good thing is to let's say split it up by types of interventions. So, I mean, what we have is like social distancing, hygiene measures, maybe in the future vaccination. Yeah, that's about it. No, yeah, contact tracing, I almost forgot. So these are the big types of interventions. I don't know, are there any others that you can think of?
Well, one category is closure of certain activities selectively. I mean, what is
okay, that's what
closing hairdressers?
For me, under social distancing.
Yes, but closure is a kind of strict distancing. If you close a certain activity, say closing restaurants.
Okay. I mean, let's say maybe we should simply start also with the social distancing because it's a very broad term and there are many things that fall under it. And I think one of the big challenges, in my view, is to kind of find out and also, let's say, model in a good way what is the impact of various, let's say, sub measures there. So for example, as you say, school closure or closure of restaurants that are two very different things and they might have different impact. And we don't really know at all how to, let's say, evaluate the impact of these measures and also how to model them, except now. Of course, even if we would have the data, which is another problem, but I think also in terms of how to describe it, at least, that's what, in my opinion, is one of the big challenges of trying to understand the impact of these lockdown measures. But I'm happy to hear your opinions about it.
I can start with an anecdote on this, which might be helpful for further discussion. When I was a postdoc in Utrecht Medical Center, I was looking also in cystic fibrosis, which is a lung disease, now pretty well treatable, but before many patients didn't make it to 25, I think. And the children, the patient organization of children with the disease, they had gatherings, but then there was some bacteria spreading among them, which might have worsened their condition, Pseudomonas something.
Yeah.
And because of that, the group or the organization for the patients stopped having outings together.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing which happened then was that the children who were actually outside this organization, also friends of each other, organized their own meeting. And instead of doing the usual safe things, they organized a trip to the water park, which possibly the worst place to go to if you want to avoid bacterial infections. So closure might actually, the effect of closure might actually be negative, and that should be taken into account in some way.
Well, I mean, a current example is that closing the pubs in Glasgow and Edinburgh has meant that people apparently are packing onto trains to go to somewhere in Fife, which is outside the zone, to go to the pubs there, which is probably, as an experience of mixing, is probably worse from a number of points of view than if they just went to the pubs in Glasgow.
Yeah, that's the same here in the Netherlands. They first had regional, let's say, measures, but it turns out that that doesn't work because then people move to other places. And now that's why there is now a national lockdown. Well, not complete lockdown, but closing of restaurants and bars.
But there must be a saving anyway, because not all the previous clients will do this moving. So there must be a balance. I mean,
yeah, I think the broad point is that there's a difference between theoretically thinking of all the possible interventions you could make and working out which are actually practical to carry out. That the I don't know what one would say. One would just say that I mean, so that there are social interactions need to take account of human behavior, and which of course brings up issues of trust and such things. So you can't.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think one can model the effects of interventions, but you need to take account of the compliance effects, and so the actual effects may be rather less or maybe displaced elsewhere compared with the simple effects you might expect. And I think related to what Miriam said a minute ago, it's not just how to model to determine the impact, but what data one might need to enable this, to actually inform that, because there seem to be a lot of questions about the extent to which any of these interventions actually has the effect that's expected because of compliance.
But this has been discussed in other kinds of circumstances, like vaccine efficacy, that whatever companies have tried will be different in the field when people don't treat the vaccine as they should, and then some don't take it, and some this and that.
Yeah.
So compliance is certainly important.
But I mean, that's important for every intervention. So, and I mean, in terms of modeling, usually we say, okay, there's a certain factor that describes the compliance, which is between 0 and 1. And I mean, the question is, do we have to make it more complicated in modeling? For example, if you think about human behavior, it's of course more complicated than just being a factor between 0 and 1, because humans have adaptive behavior. So if, let's say, if I look at the situation in the Netherlands right now, like in the summer, people were becoming very, let's say, loose in all these measures. They didn't follow it really anymore. And then, but now that where they see that the numbers are rising so steeply, people become more cautious again. And although, of course, there are people who party and who don't comply, but let's say, on average, I would think that the compliance has been rising again. So it's also, let's say, the perception of what's going on, and is it really, let's say, so bad that we have to comply with the measures or not. And yeah, this might of course be different in different countries. I don't know, at least here in the Netherlands, people have very much this attitude, okay, everybody decides for himself what they think they should do. While in other countries, it's more top down, like the government says, everybody has to do this and that's it. And people comply. I don't know how it is in the UK or in Italy.
Well, I guess that both compliance and feeling of risk is very much dependent on information and risk group. I think that old people, for instance, feel more risk than young people.
Yes, of course.
So most old people try to protect themselves, maybe by wearing masks or keeping distance or not going out. But young people have already heard that it's not dangerous for them.
Yeah.
And so they have no reason to comply, except maybe if they like their grandparents and meet them now and then. So it's there are several factors in this.
Yeah.
And the sort of approach which just applies a 0-1 fact, I mean, a factor between 0 and 1, really needs to be nuanced to allow for heterogeneity between different populations and groups.
I wonder
not
if
the same factor in all of them.
Yeah.
I mean, the average may be hiding. I wonder if there's an effect where you have a very small, very non-compliant group inside that average. What will happen with that?
Miriam is an expert of core groups.
Core group, yes. There we have it again.
In sexually transmitted diseases, that's a well-known idea that there is a core group having a lot of activity and then people around having less, and the core group can, in theory, keep everything alive and then now and then transmit it to others.
But in many countries in Europe, that core group is now already taken out, I would say.
Depends on what you mean. I mean, in Italy, very much focus has been on the young people standing close together, drinking beer in the evenings. They call it the movida. And they would be a core group of internal transmission, which doesn't really affect them because they don't get serious consequences. But they then spread it out to parents at home and then etc.
What I mean is that the core groups are in many places already have been infected in the early stages.
Yeah, that's the Swedish paper, that those core groups have almost reached immunity in themselves because they have infected so much. That's the Swedish argument, I mean.
Yeah, but it's not true, at least. Okay, I don't know in other countries, but here, let's say in the serological surveys, you find that in the age group around 20, there's maybe 10% that is infected, so we are still not near.
That's not relevant if there is a core group.
You
mean that only the okay.
Yeah,
but surely there's basic distinction we need to make between super spreading individuals and super spreading events. Well, I mean, perhaps going by restarting universities is perhaps quite a good example of that, because you have a lot of young people, some of whom might be super spreaders, who in their, when they're at home in where they live, they go out to crowded pubs or whatever a lot, or parties, or so they're potentially super spreaders in their ordinary life, but a whole variety of people who are quite a cross section of the population. But then you tell them they all go back to university, and you maybe make the mistake of putting them all in a lecture room which is not at all well ventilated for a couple of hours, and you have a super spreading event. So so I know it's obviously important from the way if you do modeling to distinguish the two.
Okay, so let's in terms of modeling, what are the challenges for us? How can we, let's say, do we need to develop new types of models, or can we do it with the tools we have?
Well, there is one thing which we also should distinguish here. Do we want to make quantitative or qualitative statements? Something has a positive effect and possibly a big effect or not. That's another question than how much effect it has. And for the question how much effect it has, we probably need more than models, but also a lot of data.
Yeah, that's true.
And the data are probably hard to, it's probably hard to disentangle what the effect is, because countries are not as nice towards modelers to take the measures one by one.
Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I mean, what we, for example, I think what one could do is that we say, okay, these and these kind of data would be needed if we want to really understand the impact of various measures. I mean, we could think about whether, let's say, all these types of closures are basically the same thing, or whether they are also, let's say, whether they are different. For example, if you think about school closure, it's in a sense a very simple measure, because you simply take away all the contacts in very specific age groups, and there's nothing to replace them.
Don't forget also all the transportation of these children back and home from school.
Yeah, okay. Transportation is already a very much more complicated thing, because in transportation you have like geographical mixing, and also
what I mean is closing schools also takes away a part of transportation.
Yeah, I understand. Although I think it's not that much, because I mean, elementary school kids mostly walk to school, and secondary school, at least here, they bike to school, so there is not that much.
But that is
there is a difference between the.
That's different.
Different in Sweden.
Oh yeah, the biking for children is a lot less, and that.
How do they get to school?
Bus more.
Okay.
So the public transport is more used, and I think that's in more countries in Europe the case.
And for younger ones, although their parents may take them, then you get the mixing of the parents, you know, because quite a lot of school gate interaction. So
yeah,
sort of cutting off different
things. So once again,
I mean, that would then
be in age groups. It's different in school age groups. I mean, from a certain age, you go by yourself with a bus. Up to a certain age, your parents take you by car or by foot.
So someone was saying, someone was saying that there was data that I think this is for the UK, that the studies that found that the main increase in transmission from children going back to schools was nothing to do with the school or the children, but it was because their parents were now free to do other things rather than having to stay at home to look after the children. So I think it's a very general point, that isn't it? That any intervention is likely to have knock-on effects or collateral effects, which are not perhaps immediately easy to estimate, to guess what these are going to be. But presumably, of course, we should be gathering large amounts of data on this kind of thing as this pandemic goes along. So perhaps by the end of the pandemic, we will have a better idea of, of how interventions work. And
but I mean, okay, so that's school closure. If you think about an intervention like closing of bars and restaurants, I think it's very different, because it's like much more diffuse what's going to happen. It's not, let's say, targeted against a specific age group, and also it's not clear whether people then meet in a different way or not. So I think it's much more difficult to assess what the impact is of such a measure, also to describe it in a model.
No, but since we, in modeling, very often rely on contact matrices of the type the polymod, where
yeah.
you, whether it's right or not, define that the contacts within a meter of distance, etc., with speaking, is a kind of potentially dangerous contact. Then, of course, in restaurants, one could measure how many person hours at a distance less than 1 meter have been performed by a certain number of clients. And then you can say that the effect of closing the restaurant is that that number of person hours at close distance has diminished. Then exactly how much important this is for infection spread, we still don't know, although we use polymod matrices, but we hope it will correlate it.
But one of the so I mean, underlying this, trying to estimate what interventions might be useful, it obviously is this understanding of transmission, and you know, the present epidemic is in a way doing us a favor in making us look much more closely at respiratory diseases and what the, you know, what circumstances are high risk for transmission. I mean, perhaps we don't have the body of literature you might have thought we would have on how flu is transmitted, and I think that's maybe because we've never tried to combat flu in this way. By lockdowns, by telling people they can't go to the pub, they're spreading flu or whatever. So I mean, it's a very general point for, you know, we're supposed to be thinking in these challenges of what happens if the next disease is something completely different, and something that presumably will have some characteristics of other diseases we know about, but just like the way COVID-19 is very similar to SARS as a virus, but particularly because of the asymptomatic phase, very different in the transmission patterns, that there's going to be a generic problem for a new disease of. So the first challenge with a new disease has obviously got to be, before you can do interventions, has got to be some understanding of how it's transmitted, of what.
So you mean we should think even, let's say, not only about COVID-19, but any type of disease?
Yeah, well, I think this is I think this is the remit. I mean, I think it's, yeah. So I think
also not respiratory, but sexually transmitted or vector-borne. I mean, then we are, of course, then it's a huge area. I mean, how are we going to cover that? Or should we, now, yeah, of course, we can think more generally about what are, let's say, factors that lead to these challenges in the future. Like, of course, we had before the COVID outbreak, the travel patterns or travel movements were increasing more and more every year. So people were like flying like crazy across the globe. Meeting everywhere, and the world population is increasing all the time. I mean, all these factors will lead to more epidemics in the future.
Yeah, I think we should. Well, I mean, it would be nice to say something general about, you know, all these other diseases, about the, you know, what factors are common to them. I don't think we can pursue all of them in detail, obviously, but so I think but in a way, I think that the present disease shows to quite an extent that even when you have quite a good qualitative understanding of how the disease is spread, if you don't have a quantitative one, it is really quite difficult to tell how successful you expect various sorts of intervention to be. So, which I suppose suggests you have to sort of judge them more empirically. And fortunately, we have plenty of data, so many different countries do different things. So you can maybe have comparative studies that say that by contrasting different countries can sort out a bit which kinds of interventions seem to make most difference.
But instead of thinking of trying to model all these, one could try to go the statistical way. I mean, it has been done for other diseases and things. You do case control studies. You take people who have been infected, similar people have not been infected. You investigate backwards what kind of behaviors they have been engaging in a reasonable period of time from a list of things that we think might be interesting for the spread. Like, have you been to restaurants? Have you been to pubs? Have you been to school, etc.? And of course, Dennis will come back to Rumsfeld, who can only have on the list known unknowns. The unknown unknowns cannot be on the list, but that's a problem we cannot solve in a way.
I think.
And then from that, you'll have relative risks of different behaviors. And then you also do an investigation the other way, how common these behaviors are in the population. And from that, you have a kind of measure what is the most dangerous behavior according to this study. It's purely statistical. We still don't know how to model the stuff.
But I think, Gianpaolo, what you're talking about there is sort of individual level. What I was talking about is like a country level. Like I was imagining if you have country A and country B, which are very similar in all respects, except that one of those countries has closed all pubs and restaurants and the other country hasn't, then if you can measure how much lower the transmission is in one country than the other, that is you can have some kind of estimate of the effect of that particular intervention. And I think you're saying the same at the individual level. If you look at individuals who've caught it, if you could get a reasonably reliable estimate of in what circumstances they caught it, if you find that 20% of the cases you're observing are people who've caught it in a pub or restaurant.
You don't have to know how they caught it. You just have to know if they engaged in various activities that you think might be the reason they caught it, because the logistic regression will take care then of.
Yeah, sorry, yes, you're right, yes. But you see what I mean? I mean, that's a sort of individual.
Yeah, you start individually. The advantage is that you could easily have 1,000 infected and 1,000 controls, while the countries where you have this data would be, 10 or something like that, which are good. So you'd have few individuals in the country study, while you could have thousands, so a good statistical study in a way.
Yeah.
With individuals.
But to come back to Dennis's comments on a more general approach, and I'm reminded of the paper by Christoph Fraser, which I'm sure you all know, what makes an infectious disease controllable, where he looked at, let's say, very basic elements of what characterizes an infectious disease, like how long or what proportion of transmission comes before symptom onset and what's the basic reproduction number. So these kind of things. I mean, that kind of theoretical approach could be, of course, extended to look into more, let's say, in more detail at making a kind of framework in which various types of infections could fit in, and looking at what are the, let's say, the key factors. And so if we're in a specific situation, then we could maybe easily say, okay, we have to measure this and this because that's a key factor in trying to stop this outbreak. So in a sense, in that paper, it already was said that, I mean, if there's a lot of transmission before symptom onset, this will be a very difficult disease to control.
No, I think that's a very good sort of framework for making the discussion a bit wider. Yeah.
And then, of course, we are back at, let's say, more generic modeling of, what's the basic reproduction number, what does it depend on, and how do various factors enter into it? Also heterogeneity, for example. We have a
That
nice
doesn't
theory
solve
for
the
that as
problem
well.
of interventions. I mean, should you close restaurants or not? Because you have to evaluate how much of the contagion is done in restaurants.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you, in a sense, you would have to build a contact matrix that contains explicitly contacts in different settings.
Yeah, I think that they're two slightly separate things there, aren't there, Miriam? That when you get if you get a new disease, then if you do two things, obviously, is one is just recognize the ways in which it's transmitted, sexual behavior or aerosols or whatever, and secondly, try to place it on Christoph's the Christoph Fraser Papers graph in terms of what is its value of R0 and what is the percentage of cases that occur before there are symptoms, this kind of thing, then that's obviously very important. And then rather separately, and this you might have a generic sort of social mixing model, which into which you can sort of feed that knowledge to think through what kind of interventions are going to be the ones we should try for this new disease. And if you have, I'm sure you have on the shelf by now, plenty of, let's say, network models for sexual contacts. So you again, with the present epidemic, you have plenty of models for social contacts in circumstances where a respiratory disease is likely to spread. It's just a question, I suppose, of in that second stage of trying to make sure you include the most important factors. I mean, it's the.
But there is something strange about this. I have been now and then watching television, and every time you look at some program, you certainly have a virologist or an epidemiologist talking about the spread. But I have not seen or heard any, say, social scientists talking about how people are reacting or what they actually do. And that is an important component, right, in this thing, for this compliance stuff, and also for personally taking maybe more measures than what are recommended because you're afraid and whatever. I mean, there's a lot of behavioral stuff that would be interesting to understand. But I haven't seen any social scientists on television, always virologists and epidemiologists.
Yeah, even modelers.
Yeah.
But I think that the Swedish head of the public health already from the start said, we want measures which will be acceptable for a long time. But
there's also a lot of criticism of him, or not?
That's for sure. But at least there was this approach that we want something which works for a long time. The good thing I think about Sweden is that the criticism is always, okay, we want more measures, not less.
Oh yeah.
Which is what many countries would wish for, that the criticism was.
Yeah. And how is the situation in Sweden now? Do you have a second wave?
Slightly. It is going up. We are behind the rest of Europe, and it's going up with about 20% per week. So that's also slower than in.
Yeah.
And the Swedes have just yesterday or something issued a little bit stricter recommendations to people.
locally.
Recommendations.
Yeah. Now, but what I want to say is that there has been this issue of, okay, we want things which are acceptable to the people.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I mean, that has basically been in the Netherlands as well, because I mean, here the government has always said that everybody needs to take their responsibility, and it's not a, let's say, top-down approach. But okay, I think then at some point they also realized it's not, let's say, working that well as they had hoped, because people were just getting more and more careless.
Yeah. Perhaps it's changing now, but I know that in the Netherlands the public discussion was for a while led by, or the protest against the government by some sociologists, I think, Harry Stone, but who didn't have, I think, he was mainly cherry picking on data, I have the impression.
But that's also a big divider in interventions, those that go by public consent. So we recommend that you take care of yourself, and the ones that go by strict law, like Italy has suddenly declared curfew between midnight and 5 in the mornings, except for very specific motives. So that's by law in the country, and that's it. And England, Britain is a little bit similar, I think, that the things are regulations, they are not recommendations. So there are two different approaches in a sense. One is trying to convince people this is for your best, but do what you like. And the other one is, now you'll have a fine of 500 euros if you are outside without a motive.
And I think that's culturally determined. I mean, what countries do.
One of my colleagues, who's a behavioral scientist, he's always argued that it's about whether it's a narrative about we or a narrative about I. And he's been quite scathing of the UK government and quite complimentary of the Scottish government, because the Scottish government has very much cleaved to this is a we thing and we are protecting all of us, whereas the UK government has been rather more individualistic about how it's targeted. So he's quite firm in saying that it's. I think you're right about culture, but also saying that it's about narrative even within a culture.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's also interesting. I mean, how, let's say, the impact of communication on the effect of interventions. I mean, that's of course something we usually don't think about at all, let's say, as epidemiologists or more quantitative scientists. We think, okay, there's an intervention and it has a certain effectiveness, yes or no, but yeah, this aspect of that you actually have to communicate it to people and they have to adhere or not. This is also, of course, a key factor really in making it successful. So yeah, so that brings us back to the, let's say, more social science aspects of interventions, which I think that's really a challenge in how to take it into account, because there is a lot of, let's say, at least from our perspective, it's very hazy, or we don't really know how to describe it. This thing about how do human beings respond to something, how do they behave, how do they change their behavior under certain circumstances. Well, actually, it might also be a contagious phenomenon, like if there are some people who start, let's say, protesting against a certain measure, they will also convince others, and it might also spread like an epidemic, that people are resistant against a certain measure.
Well, that's interesting, because there was the talk I've heard from Audrey Tang of Taiwan about their approach was included that a sort of social media strategy, which was, and the point of which was, if you have a rumor that is a harmful rumor spreading on social media, then you have to think of a way of combating it that is something that will spread on social media better. So it was almost exactly like that, sort of, you know, you must have an answer to whatever the problem is, that spreads better on social media than the rumor you're trying to combat.
Yeah.
The example of that was the one of which was where there was, as I think there has been in several countries, there was a rumor that toilet paper was going to run out, and therefore you must stock up on this, so everyone's rushed to the supermarket to get it. And that was spreading on social media, and the answer to that was to get the Prime Minister to appear, or I'm not sure if it was a card, have a picture of him or whatever, but to sanction a picture of him appearing, so looking rather silly, but sort of slapping his behind and saying, "We only have 2 buttocks," which was which was getting across the message that you don't need to stockpile this stuff. You know, it's not as though you need infinite quantity. But the point of this was that because it was done in this sort of high-profile cartoon, making a joke of or with the Prime Minister, it spread on social media like wildfire, and thus suppressed or out-competed the rumor you were trying to defeat. So, so I think so I suppose that's part of the, so communication is part of the behavior.
Actually, the Prime Minister in the Netherlands also at some point mentioned toilet papers in one of his press briefings. He said, we do have enough toilet paper in the Netherlands to last for the coming 10 months or so, because there was exactly the same problem, that people were rushing to the supermarkets and buying it. But I mean, that brings us also to this point of communication via social media, which is, of course, a very, let's say, prominent influence on what people think nowadays. And I think it's something we don't really understand yet completely. I mean, it's very different from the, let's say, usual channels of communication, like from person to person or from the government via, let's say, public media. But it's because people in social media are also organized in these bubbles. So if you have like a certain opinion, you tend to be connected with other people with the same opinion, and you never get any other information anymore. That's one thing. And the other is this kind of also influencing via social media that we don't even notice, but that is done by whatever large companies or so who try to direct us in a certain direction. So I wonder whether that are also things that one could, let's say, analyze in a model.
It's also a political problem, I guess, for our more or less democratic societies, because if you had an authority that tried to combat bad information, you would have a ministry of propaganda, and that would not really go down well with many people in our societies, because it could also be used for other purposes if we had such a intelligence unit, right?
I wouldn't call it propaganda in that case, if you want.
No, you should call it something else for information purposes. But it would be that, right? If you had a group specialized in combating fake news or something like that.
Well, I'm sure that governments do have, let's say, groups that are trying to do that, but they're just hopelessly behind in the technological development. I mean, they are barely up to the, let's say, modern standards of technology and communication. Let's stand that they know or can use things like what big companies like Google use, or advertisement via Google or Facebook. I mean, that's very, let's say, very much based on also psychological and sociological information that these companies are collecting, which governments don't do, luckily, at least in our societies, I hope.
No, but I think we have a challenge here about how to model compliance.
Which depends on information.
And how information plays a role.
So in a sense, we are saying that information and the spread of information or attitudes or whatever is having a more and more prominent role actually in intervention research.
Yeah, I know there. I think what's his name from Catalan, John Saldana.
Mm-hmm.
He has done something on spread of information and spread of epidemic together in the network, and I think also one of Frederick Leroux's collaborators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are. I mean, we are also doing some work on it here in Utrecht, but it's, let's say, in the beginning stages.
Yeah.
So I think there is still a lot to be done, especially also, I mean, at least what I know up to now is more or less a very, let's say, very basic in terms of modeling structure and not yet really taking any data into account. So I think there might be also, let's say, room for big data approaches, because I mean, if you think about these social media networks, they are huge, and you need probably like very new technologies to actually analyze that type of data. Which I don't know that much about it, but I know that there are, let's say, approaches with artificial intelligence or whatever, text mining and these kind of things to try to analyze it. I don't know if any of you have any experience or knowledge about these kind of new approaches.
No, I was some years ago at a Newton meeting on networks organized by Bella Bolabas and others, which was very, I think it was Ernst Witt from Groningen. Was there as well, one of the organizers, and they had quite some diverse public or audience, and it was quite nice when there was one talk about information spread on Twitter and avalanches on Twitter.
Oh yeah.
And that Bella Bolabas asked the question, "What's a tweet?" So
good. Yeah.
And that was only 4 years ago, so it's
wow. Yeah, that shows the large, let's say, discrepancies between people in different strata of the society.
I think that's very admirable. I'm quite jealous. I would like, there are a whole load of things I would love not to know about, and that's one of them. What a tweet is certainly one of them.
Yeah. Although, I mean, I've also noticed now, I mean, I'm not on Twitter, but many of my colleagues are, and I mean, they do get, let's say, information on new papers that are published or so. I mean, there is, it's not that it's all nonsense, but there is also, let's say, useful information that's coming via Twitter and that you then get very quickly.
Yeah, I can recommend everybody to follow Mark Lipschitz and Adam Kucharski, because it gives you really basically all the useful new papers coming out.
Yeah.
Another point, which is coming back to what Gianpaolo said earlier about statistical methods. One thing which came up to me is Miriam referred then to Christoph Fraser's paper, which is a very important paper. Later, Kai-Yen Lung, Tom Britton, and I wrote something on who is the infector, where we actually look backwards in an epidemic and which fraction of people is infected by a certain type of people. And it's really a different question, because, but I think what Gianpaolo is was proposing is more looking at who is the infector using statistical methods. And I don't know whether that's the most useful thing, because then you might miss the competing risks, and if you find that many people are infected in the bar, you might take those bars out, but then people who were no longer exposed because they were already infected in the bar will get exposed to things which they would otherwise have encountered later and will get infected anyway.
But that's a second level question. What happens if you close the bars? I mean, then you must have research on what would you do if we close the bars?
Yeah, but even if you do the same thing as you did next to the bar, there might be another infection pressure going on, which you don't encounter that much because you already got infected in the bar.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, Christoph Fraser's paper was more useful, was really looking at the start of the epidemic and looking at the matrices and see take into account that there are competing risks. Well, what Kai-Yen, Tom, and I did was another question, but it was more related to what fraction of the population of the people who get infected is infected at the bar, say.
Mm-hmm.
Could I make an intervention? We've had an hour, and it seems to me it's a good discussion. I think there's more to say. So I would suggest that we take a 10-minute break, and I will make myself a cup of coffee. You can do whatever suits you. And maybe we should, while we're having our cup of coffee, we might think about how we might structure the challenges we've discussed. I mean, for example, we could maybe do a route from like the beginning to later on. So understanding transmission, modeling interventions in the early phase and later on, estimating effects of intervention, behavior and communications. These are just some of the things we've discussed, and that might be a logical order to put them, but maybe I would ask Miriam, since she's supposed to be guiding us, to make her own suggestion of some headings for structure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'll think about it.
While you have your cup of coffee, and I suggest we start up again at 10:40, but this is UK time, so in just under 10 minutes time. Is that okay?
Yeah, good idea.
Fine by me. Coffee will be welcome.
Okay.
Okay.
See you in a moment.
Yeah.
Would you like me to stop the recording?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be a good idea.
Okay.